Hey there, beautiful souls. Whether you're a long-time supporter or just joining us for the first time, welcome to Alcott Stories, the home of powerful, emotional, and unforgettable love stories that touch your heart and leave a lasting impact. Here, we don't just tell stories, we take you on a journey filled with passion, heartbreak, redemption, and love that defies all odds. Every tale is crafted with deep emotions, suspense, and meaningful life lessons because love isn't just about romance. It's about courage, sacrifice, and the strength to fight for what truly matters. To all our returning viewers, thank you for being part of our growing family. Your love, your comments, and your support keep us going, and we cherish each and every one of you. To our new viewers, you've just found a place where stories come alive in the most powerful way. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and get ready to dive into stories that will make you laugh, cry, and believe in love all over again. Call to action. If you love emotional, gripping love stories, make sure to like, comment, and share our videos. Tell us, what kind of stories do you want to see next? Your ideas and feedback shape this channel. Subscribe now and be part of the Alcott Stories family, where every story is a heartbeat, and every heartbeat tells a story. Now, ready to dive into the story. Elena Carter was a woman who lived quietly, humbly, and with the kind of grace that made even the most ordinary moments seem extraordinary. Her brown skin glowed with a warmth that matched her spirit. Though her life often felt far from warm, she had chosen the path of teaching, pouring her heart into each lesson, each word she spoke to her students. Her small apartment reflected the modest life she led, faded wallpaper, a chipped table, and a worn couch that had been her companion through long nights of grading papers and planning lessons. The rent was always a struggle, and often the food in her fridge barely lasted the week. But what did she have to complain about? She had her job, she had her students, and despite the emptiness of her bank account, she was content. Her heart, however, was not content. It was full of yearning, a yearning she had long since tried to bury under the weight of responsibilities and routines. Elena had never been in love, not because she didn't want to, but because she had never found someone who saw her as anything other than the beautiful woman on the outside. Men admired her looks, but none took the time to look deeper, to see her soul, to understand her heart. She had long ago accepted that love might not be in the cards for her. Her beauty was a gift, yes, but it also felt like a curse, for it often overshadowed the woman beneath the surface. There were nights when she would sit in front of her window, staring out at the lights of the city, wondering what it would be like to have someone truly see her for who she was, not just what she appeared to be. Her students were her greatest joy. They made her heart swell with pride every time they grasped a new concept or beamed with excitement over their small victories. It was their smiles, their eager voices that brought warmth to the cold, empty apartment. Teaching wasn't just a job for Eleanor, it was a calling, a purpose. She would spend hours planning, making sure that every child had the best chance at success. And in return, she received the purest form of love, uncomplicated, unpretentious, and full of gratitude. To Elena, this was the kind of love that mattered. This was what made her heart whole. Still, there were nights when loneliness crept in, when she wondered if her dreams would ever come true. Dreams of a life where love wasn't just a fleeting thought, but a constant presence. She imagined a life with someone who would understand her, who would see her struggles, her fears, and still choose to stay. But those dreams felt like distant stars, unreachable and untouchable. It wasn't that Elena was bitter about her circumstances. Far from it. She had learned to find joy in the small things. But there was always a longing, a deep, aching need to be seen for more than just her outer beauty. To be loved for who she was at her core, not just admired from afar. And so, Elena went through life, always searching, never finding. She poured her heart into her work, her students, and her dreams of something more. But in the quiet of her nights, she couldn't help but wonder if that something more would ever find its way to her. Could she ever be loved, truly loved for who she was? Or would she always remain the woman whose beauty was admired, but whose heart remained out of reach? Despite the uncertainty, Elena held on to a quiet hope. It was a small thing, a flicker of belief that love could be hers one day, but she had learned to keep it tucked away, hidden from the world. After all, who was she to believe she deserved such a thing? She was just a teacher, living a modest life, with a heart full of dreams that seemed impossible to reach. But dreams have a way of coming true when you least expect them. And Elena's life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. It was a night like any other, when Elena Carter, weary from a long day of work, found herself wandering aimlessly through the local convenience store. Her mind was a blur of thoughts about the bills she had yet to pay, the rent she wasn't sure she could make this month, and the quiet emptiness of her apartment that always seemed to be louder in the evenings. Life, despite the joy she found in her students, had been a series of struggles, some small, some large. But on this particular evening, in the midst of a mundane routine, she made an impulsive decision. Out of sheer boredom, or perhaps as a fleeting escape from the weight of her responsibilities, she bought a lottery ticket. She didn't think much of it, just a small, unimportant gesture, a ticket that would likely be tucked away in her purse and forgotten. After all, what were the odds? The thought that she could actually win never crossed her mind. She never considered herself a lucky person, nor did she believe in the kind of magic that turned ordinary lives into extraordinary ones. But life, as Elena would soon learn, has a way of surprising even the most reluctant dreamers. Days passed, and life continued on its unremarkable path. Elena graded papers late into the night, prepared lesson plans, and kept up with the routine that had become her existence. The lottery ticket sat in her purse, forgotten, buried beneath the clutter of her day-to-day life. Until one morning, as she sat down with a cup of coffee, she decided to check the numbers, more out of curiosity than hope. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked at the winning numbers on the screen, and then back at the ticket in her hand. The numbers matched, every single one. It felt surreal. Her heart pounded in her chest as the realization settled in. She had won $120 million. The words on the screen blurred before her eyes, and she could hardly comprehend what they meant. It was a sum of money she had never dared to imagine. It was more than just life-changing. It was world-shattering. Within hours, the news spread like wildfire. Elena's phone began to ring incessantly. Strangers she had never met began calling her, claiming to know her, offering their congratulations, or worse, demanding a share of her winnings. She answered the door to find news cameras and reporters lined up on her doorstep, flashing bright lights in her face as they shoved microphones at her. The world, it seemed, was more than eager to invade her quiet life. Her once peaceful apartment had turned into a circus of chaos, with people clamoring for her attention, her money, and her time. Everyone wanted something from her. The quiet, humble woman who had spent her days teaching and living modestly was suddenly a target, a prize to be won. But the most jarring change wasn't the flood of attention or the endless requests. It was the sudden appearance of distant relatives and supposed family members who came out of the woodwork, all claiming to be connected to her and hoping for a piece of her newfound fortune. Some were subtle in their approaches, others more direct, asking for handouts, loans, or promises of future gifts. Elena, in her state of shock, couldn't help but wonder if they had ever cared for her before the money, or if, like so many others, they were only interested in the financial security her windfall offered. Amidst the chaos, one thing remained steadfast: Elena herself. She was still the same woman who had taught in the same classrooms, poured her heart into her work, and lived a life of quiet simplicity. She hadn't changed. The money, as overwhelming and unexpected as it was, hadn't altered who she was at her core. All she wanted was the peace she had always sought, the quiet life where she could be herself, without the intrusion of fake relatives or strangers trying to exploit her. But that peaceful existence, it seemed, was no longer an option. The world around her had erupted, but Elena felt the weight of her own unchanged heart. As her life spiraled into an uncontrollable frenzy, all she could think about was how she wished for the same simplicity she once had, before the millions had arrived. She longed to go back to a life where the only chaos was the laughter of children in her classroom, not the demands of people who only saw her as a way to fulfill their own desires. But she knew deep down that she couldn't turn back time. The life she had known was gone, but the question remained. Could she hold on to the essence of who she was while navigating this new world that had suddenly been thrust upon her? In the midst of the madness, Elena's desire for peace became more than just a wish. It was her anchor, the only thing she could hold on to as the world spun wildly around her. But would peace ever find its way back to her? Only time would tell. Elena had hoped that buying a mansion in an exclusive neighborhood would offer her the peace she had been craving. The chaos that had followed her lottery win seemed to have no end, and she needed a place to escape. The mansion, with its sprawling grounds and towering gates, promised the kind of solitude she desperately longed for. She thought that maybe, just maybe, she could start fresh in this luxurious new chapter of her life. The mansion was grand, yes, but it was also lonely. Surrounded by silence and space, Eleanor hoped she could find the calm she sought. But she hadn't anticipated the one thing she couldn't escape. Him. Damien Vaughan, her new next-door neighbor, was a man who commanded the kind of presence that could freeze a room with a single glance. A billionaire CEO, ruthless and untouchable, Damien was the kind of man whose name alone could send shivers down the spine of anyone who dared to utter it. He was a man who had built an empire that had made him both feared and revered. His reputation was one of power, control, and precision. People trembled at the thought of crossing him, but what most didn't know, what Elena didn't know, was that behind his cold, calculating exterior, there existed a man who was deeply conflicted, someone whose life had been shaped by the very power and wealth that had distanced him from the world. Elena had been living in the mansion for a few days, still getting used to the extravagance and the space. She hadn't really paid attention to the neighbors, too caught up in the whirlwind of her own thoughts and the aftermath of the lottery. But one afternoon, as she stood at her balcony, gazing out at the immensity of the estate below, her eyes inevitably fell on the house next door. And that was when she saw him. Damien was outside, pacing along the path that led to his front door, his tall frame exuding an air of authority. His icy blue eyes, the kind of eyes that seemed to look right through a person, caught sight of her. For a moment, their gazes locked across the distance, an intensity passing between them. It wasn't the typical exchange of pleasantries that one might expect from neighbors. It was something else, something far more charged, as though they were two forces of nature on the verge of colliding. Elena felt the weight of his stare, but she didn't look away. She wasn't afraid of him. Damien, however, was. Not of her, but of something he couldn't quite name yet. The power of their gaze left him unsteady, something he hadn't experienced in years. He approached her gate moments later, walking with the kind of deliberate stride that made it clear he was used to people stepping aside for him. When he reached her door, he didn't knock, he simply waited for her to open it. Eleanor opened the door, her expression calm, though her heart raced in anticipation. "I don't think I've seen you around," he said, his voice low, almost too controlled. "Not many people move into this neighborhood without wanting something. What do you want?" His words were direct, piercing through the air, cutting to the core of the question he was really asking. But Elena wasn't intimidated. In fact, his presence seemed almost laughable to her. She knew what it was like to be underestimated. He didn't intimidate her, at least not in the way he likely thought he did. "I want peace," she said, her tone almost playful, her eyes never leaving his. "But I suppose I won't find it with you as my neighbor." There was a subtle, yet deliberate bite in her words, a challenge that made Damien pause for the briefest of moments. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was speechless. His lips parted slightly as he studied her with an intensity that was almost impossible to conceal. She wasn't afraid of him. In fact, there was a confidence in her that unsettled him. Her gaze was direct, unfazed, and it irritated him in the way that something he couldn't control always irritated him. Damien had spent his life building a fortress around himself, one of wealth, power, and emotional detachment. No one had ever looked at him like this. No one had ever dared to challenge him so effortlessly. But Eleanor was different. She wasn't bowing down to him, or even acknowledging his power. She wasn't impressed by his money or his status. Instead, she had given him something he wasn't used to, a taste of humility and a hint of resistance. There was something about her that intrigued him, something that made him want to know more. She was different from the women who flocked to him, those who wanted to be near him only for the money, the fame, or the status. Elena seemed untouched by the allure of his wealth, and that only made him want to unravel the mystery of who she really was. The silence stretched between them for a moment longer before he finally spoke again, his voice much softer this time, almost contemplative. "Peace, huh?" he said, his lips curving into a faint smile, a rare expression on his usually guarded face. "I guess we'll see about that." Elena only nodded, her smirk never leaving her face as she closed the door. She didn't expect him to change, not really, but she couldn't deny that there was something about their first meeting, a tension, a pull, that was unlike anything she had ever felt before. For the first time in a long time, Elena was intrigued. The man who had everything she could never want had somehow captured her attention, and she wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or a bad one. All she knew was that she had just met a man who could turn her world upside down, whether she wanted him to or not. Despite their rocky and tense first meeting, there was an undeniable pull between Eleanor and Damien. Every interaction between them was a spark, a brief, flickering flame that seemed to burn hotter with each passing moment. Damien, a man who had lived his life surrounded by sycophants and people eager to use him for his wealth, found something completely foreign in Elena. She was independent in a way that was both captivating and intimidating. Where others fawned over his wealth, his power, and his status, Elena remained completely unimpressed. She saw him for what he truly was, not a billionaire CEO, but a man with flaws, insecurities, and a heart that had been closed off for far too long. Damien wasn't used to being ignored, to being rendered ordinary. His presence usually commanded attention, and yet Eleanor seemed unfazed, as though he was just another man, one who happened to live next door. She wasn't afraid of him, nor was she drawn to him out of curiosity about his riches. No, Eleanor was different. And that difference intrigued him in a way nothing ever had before. Their encounters continued to be brief, but charged with an unspoken tension that neither of them could ignore. They exchanged pleasantries here and there, their words laced with something deeper, something more dangerous. Damien found himself unable to shake her from his thoughts. She had become a puzzle he couldn't quite solve, a mystery that beckoned him. It was clear that beneath her cool, collected exterior there was a woman who had been hurt, who had seen the world for what it truly was and wasn't willing to settle for anything less than real, raw connection. One evening, Damien found himself at a charity gala, an event he attended because it was expected of him, not because he wanted to be there. It was a sea of high society, well-dressed women in glittering gowns and men in sharp suits, all mingling over cocktails and exchanging empty pleasantries. Damien had no interest in any of it. He was about to make his way to the bar when, as if by fate, his eyes landed on her. Elena. She stood across the room, her figure silhouetted by the soft golden light of the chandeliers. She wasn't like the other women in the room. She didn't belong in this world of glitz and glamour. Yet there she was, dressed in an elegant gown that showcased her beauty in a way that was understated but undeniable. She stood there, talking to a few people, her laughter genuine, her smile unguarded. And yet, even from across the room, Damien could feel her pulling him in. Without thinking, he made his way through the crowd toward her, his heart beating harder with every step. When he reached her, she looked up, and their gazes locked, something magnetic swirling between them. The world around them seemed to fade, the noise of the event dimming in comparison to the electricity in the air between them. "Damien," she said with a cool smile, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of something soft, something vulnerable that made his pulse quicken. "Eleanor," he replied, his voice low, filled with something more than just simple recognition. They stood there for a moment, the space between them crackling with tension. Then, as if on cue, a slow song began to play, the music soft and inviting. The crowd shifted around them, couples taking to the floor, but neither of them moved. "Would you like to dance?" Damien asked, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, Elena hesitated. She had always been cautious with him, knowing that stepping too close would only invite complications. But the pull between them was undeniable, stronger than her reservations, and before she could stop herself, she found herself nodding. Damien's hand found her waist, and Elena placed her hand on his shoulder, her skin warm where it touched him. They began to move, slowly at first, both of them acutely aware of the closeness. Their bodies swayed to the rhythm of the music, their steps fluid but charged with an unspoken tension. There was something in the way Damien moved, in the way his hand held her, that made Elena's breath catch in her chest. She could feel his heart beating just as fast as hers. "You drive me insane, Elena," Damien whispered against her ear, his voice raw, filled with a yearning that he couldn't quite hide. Her heart pounded in her chest, the warmth of his breath sending shivers down her spine. The words, though intense, weren't as simple as they seemed. There was something deeper in them, something dangerous. Her lips parted, her own voice barely audible. "Then stay away." It wasn't a request, it was a warning. Elena knew the consequences of letting someone into her life, especially someone like Damien, someone who could ruin her or break her. She had lived a lifetime of guarding herself, and yet here she was, caught in the gravitational pull of this man who could destroy everything she had worked so hard to protect. But even as she spoke those words, even as she tried to pull back from the edge of whatever this was, she knew the truth. She didn't want him to stay away, not really, not when the chemistry between them was so palpable, so undeniable. Damien's grip tightened slightly around her waist, his lips brushing the delicate skin of her ear. "I can't," he murmured. "I'm already too far gone." Neither of them spoke for the rest of the dance, the air between them thick with unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. Elena knew she should pull away, that she should end this before it went any further, but her body refused to listen to her mind. She wanted him as much as he wanted her, more perhaps. And in that moment, surrounded by the glittering chandeliers and the soft music, they both knew that nothing, not even their resistance, could keep them apart forever. They were already in too deep. and the dangerous attraction they shared would only continue to pull them closer. It was a night drenched in rain, the kind that felt endless, as if the sky itself was crying for something lost. Elena had been driving home after a long, exhausting day at school when her car suddenly sputtered and died on the darkened highway. No amount of coaxing or restarting would make it work again. Stranded in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but the sound of the storm and her own frustration to keep her company, Elena sighed in defeat. She didn't know who she could call, or if anyone would even pick up at this hour. She stepped out of the car, the cold rain immediately soaking through her clothes, and she tried to flag down any passing car. But the night was empty, silent except for the relentless downpour. The minutes felt like hours as the storm raged, her body shivering from both the cold and the overwhelming sense of helplessness. That was when the headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the night like a beacon of hope. Elena's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know who it was, but at this point she didn't care. She needed help. As the car approached, she stepped out into the road, her arms outstretched in desperation. The sleek black car slowed, and as the rain splattered against the windows, the vehicle came to a halt. The window rolled down, and there, behind the wheel, was none other than Damien Vaughan. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, and without a word, he motioned for her to get in. "Get in," he ordered, his voice as commanding and smooth as it always was. But tonight, there was something softer in it, something that made her hesitate just for a moment. The rain was pouring so hard, though, that Elena didn't have time to protest. She opened the door and climbed into the passenger seat, her wet clothes clinging to her skin, her hair plastered to her face. Damien didn't say anything as he pulled away, the powerful engine of his car purring beneath them. Elena shivered from more than just the cold, though she tried to hide it. The warmth of the car enveloped her, but it wasn't enough to chase away the unsettling feeling in her chest. Damien didn't seem to notice. His eyes were focused on the road, his jaw clenched with a tension she couldn't quite place. The drive was silent, except for the sound of the storm and the steady hum of the car. As they neared his grand estate, Elena couldn't help but feel an unease creeping over her. Damien was, in many ways, a stranger, despite how many times their paths had crossed. Yet tonight, in the middle of this storm, everything felt different, more intimate somehow. They arrived at his mansion, the massive gates opening as they approached, and they pulled into the long driveway that led up to the house. Damien didn't wait for her to speak. He just opened the door, motioning for her to follow him into the house. She didn't argue. There was something about him that even now seemed to draw her in. He guided her inside, and the warmth of the grand foyer greeted her like a soft embrace. The mansion, despite its cold elegance, felt strangely inviting in the midst of the storm. He didn't offer her tea or ask her if she was all right. He simply led her through the house, his eyes never leaving her. They didn't speak, but the air between them was thick with something neither of them could define. They ended up in a cozy study, the fire crackling in the hearth, its glow casting dancing shadows on the walls. It was there, amidst the crackling fire and the howling wind outside, that something shifted. Elena was standing by the fireplace, her clothes still wet, her body still trembling slightly from the cold. Damien, standing a few feet away, couldn't take his eyes off her. The way the firelight danced on her skin, the way her eyes shimmered with unspoken emotion, he couldn't help but be drawn to her. Before he could think, before either of them could stop it, he crossed the room in 3 long strides, closing the distance between them. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing against her wet cheeks as he tilted her head back to meet his gaze. Her heart was racing in her chest, but she didn't pull away. There was something magnetic in the way he looked at her, something that both terrified and excited her. And then, without warning, he kissed her, His lips crashed against hers with a force that stole her breath, the urgency in his touch making her pulse quicken. It wasn't gentle and it wasn't hesitant. It was raw, hungry, and desperate. She felt every ounce of that desperation flood through her as the kiss deepened. Every inch of her body responded, her hands finding their way to his chest, gripping the fabric of his shirt like it was the only anchor she had left in the world. The kiss was everything she had never known she needed. It was a collision of heat, passion, and something else, something deeper. She could feel him, not just physically but emotionally, his walls crumbling down piece by piece as he gave in to the same undeniable pull that had been growing between them for so long. It was the storm that broke them, or perhaps it was the years of solitude and longing, of being seen for nothing more than surface beauty. For the first time, Elena felt truly seen, and Damien, for all his wealth, power, and fearsome reputation, was vulnerable in a way he had never allowed anyone to see. When they finally broke apart, gasping for air, Elena's heart was still racing. She had given him a part of herself that no one had ever touched before, a part of her that was unguarded and raw. And as Damien looked down at her, his blue eyes clouded with emotions he couldn't put into words, she realized that this night, this storm, had changed everything. They stood there, both trembling, but neither of them pulling away. And in that moment, Elena knew that whatever came next, they couldn't deny the connection between them anymore. The following morning, Elena's world came crashing down. She had woken up to the shrill sound of her phone ringing, the caller ID flashing with unfamiliar numbers. At first, she ignored it. But when her phone buzzed with dozens of notifications, her curiosity got the better of her. She opened a news app, and as soon as the headline appeared on her screen, her stomach sank. Lottery winner Elena Carter, just another plaything for CEO Damien Vaughn. The words hit her like a physical blow. Her heart clenched in her chest as she read the article, the harsh words tearing through her like a blade. The piece was full of speculation, accusations that Damien had been using her, that she was just another one of his conquests, a distraction to him in the midst of his empire. The insinuations were clear. Her wealth had drawn him in, not her. Her hands shook as she scrolled, trying to find some semblance of truth, some detail that could clear his name. But all she found was a carefully crafted narrative that painted her as nothing more than a naive fool. She felt a wave of betrayal flood through her veins, suffocating her. All those moments, all those stolen kisses, all those promises they had made to each other, had they meant nothing to him? Had he been pretending? Or was she just another pawn in his world of power and wealth? Her thoughts spiraled out of control. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She had trusted him. She had opened her heart to him in ways she had never done before. And now, it seemed like everything she had believed in was a lie. The tears came, hot and fast, as anger bubbled up from deep inside her. She couldn't sit by and let this go. She had to confront him. She had to demand answers. Without a second thought, she slammed her phone down and stormed out of her apartment, her mind set on one thing, finding Damien. She arrived at his office building, her footsteps heavy with determination. The towering glass structure seemed to mock her as she entered, the sleek lobby reflecting her shattered reflection in its polished floors. She walked past security without a word, ignoring the cautious glances of employees who knew her face by now. She wasn't in the mood to play nice, not when her heart was breaking. When she reached his office, the receptionist greeted her with a smile, but it faltered when she saw the look on Elena's face. "Miss Carter?" she started, but Elena didn't give her the chance to finish. "I need to see Damien, now." The receptionist hesitated for a moment, then pressed the intercom button. "Mr. Vaughn, Elena Carter is here to see you." Damien's response was a curt, "Send her in." As Elena stepped into his office, her eyes locked onto him immediately. His face was impassive, unreadable, and it made her blood boil. He was standing by the window, looking out over the city, as though everything was normal. "Damien," she started, her voice trembling but filled with raw emotion. "What is this?" She thrust her phone towards him, her eyes burning with anger. "Did you think I wouldn't find out? Was I just a game to you? A little distraction from your empire?" Damien's eyes flicked to the phone, and his face darkened, his jaw tightening. He stepped forward, but Elena backed away, her hands trembling at her sides. She couldn't bear to be touched by him. Not now. "Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" she continued, her voice rising with each word. "After everything, after the nights we spent together, after the promises we made, you turned me into a tabloid joke?" Damien's eyes narrowed, his frustration mounting. He opened his mouth to speak, but Elena didn't give him a chance. "I gave you my trust, Damien," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought you were different, but you've proven me wrong. I was just a naive fool to believe you were any better than the rest of them." She could feel the sting of betrayal deep in her chest, but it was the hurt in her voice that cut through the air like a knife. It wasn't the public humiliation that crushed her. It was the fact that he never once gave her the truth. He never told her how much he needed her, or how his feelings for her went beyond the surface. All she had was the cold, cutting headlines that painted her as a pawn in his game. Damien's face twisted in frustration, and he stepped toward her. "Elena, you think I planted that story? You think I need your money?" His voice was rough, his usual control slipping. "I didn't do this. I would never use you like that. Do you hear me?" But it didn't matter. His words fell on deaf ears. Elena had already made up her mind. The damage had been done. She had trusted him, and now that trust was shattered into pieces she couldn't put back together. "Then why, Damien?" she asked softly, almost pleading. "Why was I foolish enough to believe you were different?" Her words hung in the air, each syllable heavier than the last. She looked into his eyes one last time, searching for some sign of the man she had once thought she knew. But all she saw was the cold hardness of a man who had used her, whether intentionally or not. Without another word, she turned and walked away. Every step she took felt like a weight dragging her down, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to get out of there before the tears overwhelmed her completely. She didn't look back. Damien stood in his office, his fists clenched at his sides. He watched her leave, his heart sinking with the realization of what he had done. He had failed her, and in that moment, he understood what it felt like to lose something that mattered more than anything else. For the first time, Damien was afraid, not of losing money or power or anything else. He was afraid of losing her. The days that followed were an unrelenting blur. Elena did her best to push Damien from her mind, but every corner of her life seemed to echo with reminders of him. His name lingered in every conversation, the glances she caught in the street, the haunting flashes of their moments together, each one a reminder of the love she had lost. Damien's attempts to reach her were relentless. He sent texts, left voicemail after voicemail, and even tried to visit her at her apartment. But Elena couldn't bring herself to speak with him. Each time her phone rang with his name, her stomach twisted, and the pain in her heart deepened. How could she face him? How could she look into his eyes when she felt so betrayed, so foolish, forever believing in him? She kept herself busy with her work, throwing herself into her teaching and the causes she believed in. But the truth was, no matter how many distractions she surrounded herself with, there was one truth she couldn't escape. One morning, Eleanor woke up with a faint dizziness, an unusual sensation that made her pause for a moment. She had been feeling off for a few days, tired, nauseous and moody, but she chalked it up to stress, the constant barrage of media attention, the pressure of her new life as a lottery winner, and the emotional roller coaster she had been on had taken their toll on her. But this morning the dizziness wouldn't go away. It was a wave that made her sit down for a moment, gripping the edge of her kitchen counter to steady herself. It felt like something was happening in her body, something she couldn't ignore, A deep, horrifying thought, began to form in the back of her mind, and she knew exactly what it was. She took a deep breath, trying to dismiss it. It couldn't be. But as she glanced at the calendar and realized she was late, the sickening feeling in her stomach told her otherwise. She knew she couldn't run from it anymore. With a trembling hand, she grabbed her phone and scheduled an appointment at the clinic. The thought of seeing the doctor, the test, the undeniable proof, it all terrified her. But the reality of the situation set in, and she could no longer ignore it. Hours later, she sat nervously in the sterile room, staring at the walls. The cold, clinical air felt suffocating as the nurse returned, her eyes gentle as she handed Elena the small, cold stick. It only took a few minutes. The results were clear. Elena was pregnant. The news hit her like a tidal wave, a rush of emotions flooding her system all at once. Her first instinct was panic. Fear gripped her chest. Her breath quickened as she tried to wrap her mind around the overwhelming reality. How could this have happened? What would she do now? How would she raise a child, let alone deal with the complicated feelings she had about Damien? Would he even want to be involved in this? Would he resent her for keeping it a secret? But amid the fear, there was something else, something she hadn't expected, a flicker of joy, a flutter of warmth deep inside her. Despite the confusion, despite the uncertainty, Elena knew one thing with certainty. This child was a part of her. And no matter how complicated it all seemed, she couldn't deny the love she felt, even before she had held the baby in her arms. And yet the heartbreak remained. The betrayal, the shattered trust. She couldn't ignore the fact that the man who was supposed to be her partner had left her to fight this battle alone. He hadn't even tried to understand her pain, her confusion. He had abandoned her when she needed him most. The thought of reaching out to Damien made her stomach twist with anxiety. What would she even say to him? How could she look him in the eye and let him know that she was carrying his child after everything that had happened? But she knew she couldn't hide from him forever. The truth couldn't be kept locked away inside her. It would destroy her. She had to face him, for the sake of their child, for the sake of what they had shared, even if it had all been tainted by lies and mistrust. So, she made a decision. It wasn't an easy one, and every part of her screamed to run away, to protect her heart from further pain. But she couldn't. She needed to tell him. The thought of seeing him again made her heart ache, but she couldn't let fear dictate her future. Her child deserved the truth, and maybe, just maybe, Damien deserved a chance to make things right. Elena's hands trembled as she stood in front of Damien's mansion, the weight of her decision bearing down on her. Every part of her wanted to turn away, to run back to the comfort of her apartment where everything was still familiar. But she knew she couldn't. The life growing inside her, the connection she shared with Damien, those things could not be ignored. She had to face him. As she rang the doorbell, her pulse raced. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and then the door opened. Damien stood in front of her, his posture rigid, eyes unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them crackled with tension, the silence oppressive. Damien looked at her with those piercing blue eyes that had once made her heart race with longing, but now they held something else, something dark and full of guilt. His jaw clenched as if he were holding something back. He didn't speak. He just stood there, waiting. Elena's voice was barely a whisper when the words left her lips. "I'm pregnant." The weight of those 3 words hung in the air, heavier than anything she had ever said before. She watched as Damien's expression shifted. His eyes darkened, his lips parted slightly, as if he hadn't expected her to come here, but he had been preparing for something like this. Something about her confession cracked the facade he had built around himself. For the first time, she saw him vulnerable. His gaze softened, and Elena's breath hitched. She had spent so many nights angry with him, resentful for how he had broken her trust. But in that moment, standing before him, she saw the hurt in his eyes. She saw the truth, the fear, the uncertainty. He took a deep breath, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly, and his voice was hoarse when he spoke. "I already knew." Eleanor's heart stopped, her world swirling in disbelief. "How?" Her voice cracked, unable to process the weight of his words. Damien closed his eyes for a moment, as if collecting his thoughts. When he opened them again, the emotion that filled his gaze was raw and vulnerable, more than she had ever seen before. "I suspected. The way you've been avoiding me, the way you looked at me after everything. I knew it in my gut. But I didn't know how to fix what I broke. I didn't know if you'd even want me anymore." His voice trembled slightly. "But Elena, I never stopped wanting you. Never." The words hung in the air like a spell, shattering the walls she had so carefully built around her heart. She had spent weeks trying to numb the ache, the loneliness, trying to convince herself that she was better off without him. But now, hearing him speak these words, her heart pounded painfully in her chest. She had tried so hard to protect herself from him, to push him away. But hearing his confession, hearing the rawness of his feelings, made everything inside her tremble. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a brief moment, everything around her went silent. She looked into his eyes, searching for any hint of the man who had once been so cold, so distant. But all she saw now was vulnerability, and something else, something she couldn't deny. It was love. But could she forgive him? Could she trust him again after everything that had happened? Could she let go of the betrayal and the heartbreak, knowing that their love was still there, buried beneath the pain? Damien stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers, his voice soft but firm. "Elena, I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I need you to know this. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. I've messed up, but I'll spend every day of my life proving to you that I want this, that I want us." Elena swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. Her emotions were a whirlwind, a clash of fear, anger, love, and hope. Could she really let herself love him again after all the hurt? Was it possible to rebuild the trust they had lost? Damien's hand reached out, gently brushing her cheek, and for the first time the touch felt like a promise that he was no longer the man who had betrayed her. He was the man who, despite everything, still loved her. As his lips hovered close to hers, Elena felt the weight of her decision, the decision to open her heart again, to take a leap of faith. But for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope. With trembling hands, she reached up to touch his face, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet, Damien, but I can't pretend that I don't still love you." Damien's expression softened, relief flooding his features. "Then let's take this one step at a time, Elena. No rush. I'll wait for you." And as their lips met in a slow, tender kiss, the world around them faded. The future was uncertain, the road ahead difficult. But in that moment, they both knew one thing for sure. Love had found a way back. Elena's mind raced, caught between the pain of betrayal and the deep-seated love she couldn't seem to let go of. Damien's confession had cracked open the walls she had built around her heart, but the scars of the past were still fresh. How could she trust him again after everything that had happened? After the headlines, the rumors, the way he had seemed to use her like some fleeting plaything. Was it all part of a game, a strategy? Could she let herself be vulnerable again? She spent nights tossing and turning, wrestling with the ache in her chest, torn between the man she thought she had known and the one who stood before her now, begging for her forgiveness. Every moment felt like a battle, and she was terrified of losing herself in a love that had already hurt her so deeply. But Damien wasn't going to let her go. No matter how much she pushed him away, no matter how many times she tried to shut him out, he kept fighting. Every day he showed up, his presence unwavering, his love relentless. He wasn't just apologizing with words, he was showing up in every action, every gesture, proving that he was ready to do whatever it took to win her back. It started with the defamation suit. The media had painted her as nothing more than a gold digger, someone after his fortune, and the weight of those lies crushed her. But Damien stepped forward, taking the brunt of the battle. He sued the tabloids, the gossip magazines, and the online bloggers who had dared to tarnish her name. It wasn't just a fight for his reputation, it was a fight for hers. He wanted to make sure the world knew she wasn't some prize to be fought over. She was a woman worthy of respect, dignity, and love. When the lawsuit hit the news, Elena couldn't help but feel a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. How could he do this? How could he stand in front of the world and fight so fiercely for her when she had barely given him the time of day? He was a billionaire, someone whose empire spanned across continents. He had everything, yet here he was, laying it all on the line for her. But that wasn't all. Damien did the unthinkable. He walked away from business deals worth billions, deals that could have made him even more powerful, more untouchable. He let them go without a second thought. In the grand scheme of his empire, the fortune and influence he had built seemed so insignificant. What mattered now was Elena. She was worth more to him than everything he had ever owned. More than the high-rise buildings, more than the boardrooms, more than the endless zeros in his bank account. At first, Elena couldn't understand it. How could he give up so much for her? She was just one person. He had everything, the wealth, the power, the fame. She had nothing, and yet he was choosing her over it all. Her heart trembled at the weight of his sacrifice, but despite the confusion and the hurt, something began to shift inside her. She saw his actions, his willingness to let go of his world, to create a space for hers. The man who once seemed so cold, so untouchable, was now so human in his vulnerability. He wasn't just fighting for her love, he was fighting for their future. He was showing her that she was enough, that she mattered. And then came the letters. Handwritten letters, long and full of raw emotion, detailing every reason why he had messed up, but also why he loved her beyond reason. In each letter, there was a vulnerability she hadn't seen before, his deepest fears, his regrets, his hope that she would give him a second chance. Every word was an act of love. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He was showing her that he was willing to earn it, no matter how long it took. When Eleanor saw how far he was willing to go, how he had sacrificed everything to prove that she was worth more than all the wealth in the world, her walls finally began to crack. The anger, the bitterness, the doubt, all of it started to melt away under the weight of his love. She had tried so hard to protect herself, but now, in the face of his unwavering commitment, she couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was a way back. Her eyes stung with tears as she watched him. He was no longer the man who had hurt her, but the man who had fought through the fire to get to her, to show her that he was capable of love. True love. And maybe, just maybe, it was worth giving him a chance to prove it. For the first time in weeks, Elena felt the pull of hope. Could they rebuild what had been broken? Could love survive the scars of betrayal? She didn't know the answer yet. But one thing was clear. Damien was willing to fight for their love, and for the first time in a long time, Elena allowed herself to believe that maybe she could fight for it too. The storm outside was a reflection of the chaos within. The rain fell in heavy sheets, splattering against the windows, the wind howling like a living thing. Inside Elena's home, the silence was deafening. Her heart, still bruised from the betrayal, seemed to beat in slow, painful thuds. The doubts, the fears, the anger, They had all been eating away at her, threatening to swallow her whole. She had been fighting for so long to protect herself from the pain of loving someone who had broken her. But then, in the midst of her darkest hour, there was a knock at the door. At first, she ignored it. She couldn't bear to face him again. She couldn't bear to see the man who had shattered her trust standing before her, asking for a second chance. But the knock persisted. The sound, insistent and urgent, rang out in the stillness, like a lifeline in the storm. Finally, with a heart that felt too heavy to move, Elena opened the door. Standing there, soaked to the bone and drenched in the cold rain, was Damien. His usually impeccable suit clung to his frame, his hair plastered to his forehead, but it wasn't the soaked clothes or the mess of the storm that captured her attention. It was his eyes, his desperate, pleading eyes that locked onto hers with an intensity she couldn't ignore. "Elena," he whispered, his voice rough, as if it had been torn from him by the weight of the moment. "I don't deserve you, but I swear I will spend my life making up for it, if you let me." She stood frozen, the world around her disappearing in that single moment. The storm raged on, but in that heartbeat, it felt like they were the only two people left on earth. His words echoed in her mind, and despite every ounce of resistance she had left, her heart broke open again, but this time in a way that felt like healing. Damien had been standing there in the rain for God knows how long, vulnerable and raw. The man who had once been the embodiment of power, the man who could destroy worlds with a single word, was now standing there, asking for something he could never have, her forgiveness. He wasn't offering grand gestures or empty promises. He was offering his soul, the very essence of who he was. Tears welled up in Elena's eyes, the emotions overwhelming her. She had been so determined to protect herself, to keep him at arm's length, but standing there in front of him, she realized how much she had longed for him, how much she had wanted to believe in the love he had shown her, even if it had been clouded by mistakes. Her heart ached, not just from the hurt, but from the longing to believe in the possibility of a love that could survive, that could heal the wounds of the past. She took a step forward, the cold air swirling around them, but her movements felt warm, filled with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in so long, hope. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his soaked shirt, and then, in that moment of vulnerability, she spoke the words that had been waiting inside her for so long. "You already have." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. His heart skipped a beat, the weight of everything they had been through crashing down on him all at once. He had never wanted anything more than to be the man she deserved. He had never wanted anything more than to prove that he could love her with every part of his being, even if it meant starting over from scratch. And now, standing there in the pouring rain, hearing her say that he had already begun to make up for everything, that he had already begun to heal her heart, was more than he could have ever hoped for. A raw, broken sob escaped his chest as he closed the distance between them, wrapping his arms around her. The rain soaked them both, but they didn't care. All that mattered was the love they shared, the unspoken promises they had made, and the willingness to fight for each other, no matter the odds. "I love you, Elena," Damien whispered against her ear, his voice trembling with emotion. "I always will." And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elena allowed herself to believe it. She allowed herself to believe in the power of love to heal, to forgive, and to start anew. In that moment, everything else faded away, the storm, the pain, the scars. All that remained was them, standing together in the rain, finally ready to face whatever came next, knowing that their love had defied everything. The years that followed were nothing short of a beautiful transformation, not just for Damien and Eleanor, but for the world they had begun to shape together. It had been months since the stormy night when everything had shifted, when Damien's rain-soaked plea for forgiveness had bridged the gap between their broken hearts. Since then, they had built a life that no one could have ever predicted, a life grounded in love, redemption, and the quiet joy of shared dreams. The birth of their twin daughters marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where their love, once fractured, now bloomed in the purest form. The twins, with their dark brown eyes and tufts of wild curls, were the perfect blend of their parents, Damien's sharp intellect and Elena's boundless compassion. Every night they would fall asleep in their parents' arms, the quiet rhythm of their breath filling the house with peace. And in those moments, Elena would marvel at how much their little girls represented everything she had once thought was impossible. Damien, the man who had once been consumed by ambition and empire, was now a father who adored his daughters with a depth he never knew he was capable of. He would spend hours with them, teaching them about the world, showing them the stars from their backyard, and telling them stories of courage, love, and kindness. His once intimidating presence softened when he held his girls, his heart brimming with a love that surpassed anything he had ever felt before. The business deals, the empire, the money, none of it mattered compared to the joy he found in their laughter. He would often look at Elena, a soft smile playing on his lips, and think to himself that he would give everything he had to ensure their daughters grew up in a world of love and opportunity. Elena, too, had found a new purpose. With her newfound wealth, she didn't retreat into a world of luxury or isolation. Instead, she channeled her resources into something that would outlast her, the gift of education. She built schools in underprivileged areas, pouring her heart into giving children the education they deserved. Each school was a reflection of her own journey, humble beginnings, resilience, and the belief that every child, no matter their background, had the potential to change the world. As she walked through the hallways of her schools, seeing children's eyes light up with the promise of a brighter future, Elena felt a deep sense of fulfillment. It was as though every step she took toward creating a better world was also a step toward healing her own soul. The love that had once seemed so fragile, so tentative, was now the foundation upon which their future was built. There were no more secrets, no more misunderstandings. The love they shared was now unwavering, rooted in the honesty, vulnerability, and respect they had learned to give one another. They had both grown, both healed, and both found a purpose greater than themselves. As they stood together on the balcony of their home, looking out over the city that had witnessed their rise and fall, Elena leaned into Damien's side, her head resting against his shoulder. The night was quiet, the city lights twinkling in the distance, but within their little world there was a profound sense of peace. "Do you remember," she asked softly, "when I thought this could never be my life? When I believed I was destined for something so much smaller?" Damien turned to her, his eyes full of tenderness. "I remember, and I'm glad you didn't give up on us." Elena smiled, her heart full of gratitude. "We didn't give up. We just had to fight for what was real." And in that moment, standing there together, they knew that their love had become something bigger than both of them. It wasn't just a love that had healed their broken hearts. It had created something lasting, something that would ripple through time. The legacy of their love, their redemption, and their commitment to each other and to the world would live on in their daughters, in the schools Elena built, and in the hearts of everyone whose lives they touched. Their love was no longer just a story. It was a testament to the power of second chances, the importance of forgiveness, and the belief that no matter how lost you may feel, there is always a way back to the light. And so, with their daughters sleeping soundly in the rooms above, with the world beyond their walls a place of endless possibility, Damien and Elena stood side by side, knowing that they had built something beautiful together, a future filled with love, hope, and a promise to always fight for what mattered most, each other. Their love was anything but easy. It was messy, tumultuous, and often painful. There were days when they questioned whether they were strong enough to make it, moments when the weight of the world seemed too much to bear. Elena and Damien were imperfect people, just like everyone else, each carrying their own baggage, their own scars. But in a world that often seemed divided by wealth, status, and race, they chose to build a love that transcended all those boundaries. At times, it felt like the world was constantly testing them. Society, with its prejudices and assumptions, couldn't understand why a billionaire CEO and a woman who had once struggled to make ends meet would fall in love. They faced whispers, judgment, and stares whenever they stepped out together. People couldn't wrap their heads around how their love could survive in a world so obsessed with status and appearances, but neither of them cared. What mattered most was the bond they shared, the silent moments of understanding, the laughter that echoed in their home, the quiet support they offered each other when the world was too loud. Elena, once a woman who had barely enough to feed herself, now stood side by side with the man who had everything. And yet, despite all the wealth in the world, it was love, and only love, that made their lives feel complete. Their relationship wasn't about material wealth or the power that came with their respective positions. It was about choosing each other day after day, even when it felt like the world was against them. It was about the courage to fight for something that didn't fit the traditional mold of love. The kind of love that defied society's rules, that didn't care about race, class, or superficial differences. They had fought for it, and in doing so they proved that love, real love, is far more important than any wealth or title could ever be. The ripple effect of their love began to spread far beyond their private world. Their story was one of redemption and transformation, of rising above the barriers society placed in their path. People who once judged them began to question their own preconceived notions. The world watched as Elena and Damien built something that wasn't just about them. It was about breaking down the walls that divided people and replacing them with bridges of understanding, empathy, and love. In their hearts, they carried the knowledge that love was not a game of status or power, but a quiet revolution that could change everything. By the time they stood together, watching their daughters grow, they realized that their love had created something greater than they ever imagined. It had shaped not just their own lives, but also the lives of those who looked up to them. They had become symbols of a love that transcended everything the world taught them to believe in. Their love had created ripples of hope, courage, and transformation. They had proven that love is not about perfection, it's about choosing the person who matters to you, even when the odds are against you. Love is about the willingness to fight for it, to stand up against the world's expectations, and to trust in the journey, even when it's messy. Love is about seeing beyond status, race, or wealth. It's about fighting for the people who truly matter, no matter the obstacles in your path. True love isn't defined by what you have, but by who you choose to be with. In the end, love is the force that changes everything.